Hello and welcome everybody to the October installment of SciComm Lunch and Learn. I'm Jory Weintraub and I'm the Science Communication Director with Duke University's Initiative for Science and Society, which is the sponsor of this monthly Lunch and Learn series. For those of you who aren't familiar with the series, SciComm Lunch and Learn is a monthly series in which we explore interesting aspects of science communication in an informal science cafe type format, which means we generally strive to keep the formal presentation, to about 20 to 30 minutes to leave plenty of time for question and answer. So you will have opportunities to ask questions today, and I encourage you all to type your questions into the chat. We will be monitoring the chat and we will answer your questions, as many of them as we can get to. I'll introduce our speaker in a moment, but first I just want to give a quick plug for next month's session. Next month on November 10th at noon Eastern Time, we will have Duke pediatrician Dr. Richard Chung talking about the unique challenges of communicating health information to teens. You can read more about that event and RSVP at our website, and we'll put that link into chat right now so you can get that information and RSVP for next month's event. We will then take the month of December off, and we'll be back in the spring with more SciComm Lunch and Learn. With that, I'm very pleased to introduce today's speaker, Dr. Rob O'Malley. Rob is a project director for the AAAS, or American Association for the Advancement of Science, Dialogue on Science, Ethics, and Religion, also known as DOSER. Rob's been with DOSER for the last 5 years, and his job there is to facilitate constructive public engagement between scientists and scientific communities with the broader public. Rob's bachelor's degrees in anthropology and zoology, a master's in anthropology, and a PhD in integrative and evolutionary biology. In addition to conducting research on primate behavioral ecology, Rob has taught biological anthropology at colleges and universities across the country, and has participated in public engagement with science through programs of the Smithsonian Institution and Skype a Scientist program, among others. We are really pleased to have Rob join us today to talk about the DOSER program and the critically important issue of how to do science engagement with and within faith communities. So with that, Rob, I just want to thank you for being here and spending some time with us today, and offer for you to take it away. Thank you again for being here.
Okay, thank you so much. I think I am sharing my slide. Could you give me a thumbs up, Jory? Yes,
you're good.
Great. So yes, thank you for joining us, and thank you for that introduction, Jory. I'm attended a number of these sessions over the last year or two, and I'm really pleased to be able to host this time. As Jory said, my name is Rob O'Malley. My pronouns are he, him, and his. And before beginning my presentation, I want to gratefully acknowledge the diverse and vibrant Indigenous peoples on whose ancestral homelands we stand. I am joining you from West Central Maryland, the ancestral homeland of the Piscataway people. And for those in North America, I encourage each of you after our session to visit an Indigenous lands resource at nativeland.ca, and I just put that in chat, which can be a route to learning more about the Indigenous communities that call your region home. And I would also, as an additional call to action, given that we are here to kind of talk about science and society issues, I want to very strongly encourage you to take some time out of your day as your time permits, and to watch a keynote from the Inclusive SciComm Symposia last week by Dr. Max Liberon on research, communication, and land relations. And that is at the YouTube link that I've also just posted in chat. Just very highly, highly recommended. And I also just want to really appreciate your willingness to take time out of your day for this discussion. This topic, I think, is really central to science communication, and it can also be a very personal and sometimes emotional domain to be thinking about science engagement, and it can take people all of us outside of our comfort zones. So I do encourage you to approach our time here today with a mindset of curiosity and mutual respect and empathy. I also want to say that whether you identify as a person of faith or not, you almost certainly have company in the room. And I also want to encourage you to just introduce yourself in chat and share where you're joining us from, and maybe something about what you hope to learn or share today. I certainly have some things I hope to share, but I also really view these types of engagements as opportunities to learn. And there is a lot of expertise and experience in the room that I hope we will get to. And Jory will keep me honest on time because I know that we want to have some engagement at the end. Okay, advancing. That did advance, Jory. Can you give me a thumbs up? Yes, okay. So a bit about me and my background. As Jory said, I am a behavioral ecologist. A lot of my work has happened in Gombe National Park in Tanzania, the site made famous by Jane Goodall. And I spent a lot of time teaching human origins and evolution and also primate behavior at universities across the US. I'll also add that while I don't identify as such now, I was raised Catholic, and I was considered myself a practicing Catholic for the first half of my life. And most of my family is Catholic, and I also have members of the family who are part of other branches of Christianity. I have members of my family who are practicing Jews. And my father actually attended seminary for a number of years before I was born. And luckily for me, he decided not to become a priest in the end. But all that life experience really does inform how I think about science and faith intersections. So in 2016, I went to work at AAAS, which is the largest multidisciplinary science society in the world, founded in 1848. The AAAS publishes the science family of journals and also supports a wide range of programs and activities in education, science policy, advocacy, and in public engagement. So why does AAAS do all these things? Why don't they just stick with publishing Science magazine? Well, or the science family of journals? Well, on the wall behind me, you'll see that the AAAS mission is summarized as advancing science and serving society. But science doesn't occur in a vacuum. It has a social, cultural, and political context. It has real impacts on people in the world. And if we're going to live up to this lofty rhetoric of advancing science and serving society, this lofty rhetoric where, frankly, science often falls short in terms of serving all people, science and its practitioners need to be in active dialogue with society at large. So the Dialogue on Science, Ethics, and Religion, or DOSER program, has been part of AAAS since 1995. The goal, as Jory noted, was to facilitate communication and engagement between scientific and religious communities, recognizing that these often overlap. And the existence of this program reflects an understanding that culture, including religion and faith, do play a central role in how many people in the US and worldwide frame interests, questions, and concerns about science and technology. Our activities are centered on sharing different perspectives about science, identifying areas of common interest and concern, and modeling inclusive discourse among scientists, policymakers, ethicists, religious leaders, and diverse segments of the largely religious US public. So for my time today, what I'm going to start with is sharing some general principles that guide our program's work. This is kind of a whirlwind coverage of what we talk about when we give workshops and things. I'll then provide a brief outline of some of our recent and ongoing program activities that fall into two broad buckets: science and theological education, and engaging scientists and faith communities. I'll close by noting some resources that we've made available online, and then we will shift to discussion. So one first principle or concept that I think is worth emphasizing is that the idea that scientists just need to give the public the facts about science, and then they'll start thinking about scientific issues the way scientists do, that the problem with science discourse is that the public simply has a deficit of correct factual knowledge, is called the deficit model. And if you spent any time in science communication spaces, you've probably heard of the deficit model. And clear communication of accurate information is definitely important, but a growing body of research suggests that simply telling people about science, letting facts speak for themselves, isn't necessarily going to have a major impact either on public opinion or informal STEM education. That really facts are not enough. Facts alone are not always compelling or impactful in engaging people's interests, in changing people's minds about a topic, or encouraging further action on that topic. They do matter, but they're not enough, often not enough. And this is particularly true about politically or socially contested science topics, where the tensions are not necessarily about the science itself, the actual dating methods by which we learn how to identify how old a rock is or a piece of petrified wood is, but about identity and culture and values, the implications of those scientific facts. And so what seems to be impactful, and the research on this is growing, is an approach of engagement, which AAAS defines as intentional, meaningful interactions and opportunities for mutual learning between scientists and the public. So this engagement includes multidirectional dialogue, addressing benefits and limitations of science, responding to issues and concerns that are raised by the public, and respecting the public as having expertise and relevant knowledge and insight into science and society issues. So fundamentally, engagement approaches are trying to move beyond one-way communication into something more collaborative, something involving or leading to action. This can include dialogue, communal activities, civic activism, or simply setting the stage for future independent learning. Another thing I want to emphasize at the beginning is that many faith communities already engage with the public about science. And many faith communities have real credibility within their communities on critical science and society issues like vaccine hesitancy, social inequality, climate change, conspiracy theories, racism, white supremacy. And faith communities are well positioned to disseminate information, to mobilize volunteers and communities for civic action. So if you as a scientist or science communicator are reflecting or interested in thinking about how science engagement that you're doing or want to do, if you're thinking about this within the faith community context, I encourage you to think about how this might align with existing community concerns and ongoing activities. Another point that I want to share that guides a lot of our work is that there is a science of science communication and engagement, research on how to communicate science impactfully, barriers to learning science or participating in science discourse. And this is particularly true for politically or socially contested topics, climate change, evolution, GMOs, and so on. And this work, along with national surveys, show that most US adults are enthusiastic about science. Most US adults, about 7 in 10, also claim a specific religious identity. And what this means in practice can be complicated, but what it does signal is that if you are engaging with other people on a regular basis about science, you are engaging with faith communities and people of faith. And of course, many scientists are also people of faith. Up to 30% of biologists and physicists PhDs, according to one recent survey. And so this is important in thinking about public engagement and discussion with policymakers, in classrooms, and even in discourse in science spaces, which are often treated, even though they shouldn't be, as purely secular spaces. Whether or not it's explicit, if people are in the room, faith probably is too. As I mentioned earlier, social science research suggests that most US adults are generally supportive of science, respect scientists as experts in their fields, that they know what they're talking about, but don't view them as particularly warm or trustworthy. And there's a broad perception that scientists tend to be cold, asocial, disinterested in the moral dimensions and real-world impacts of their work. And of course, this is perception, not necessarily reality, but it's a very powerful perception. And scientists are often typically perceived as hostile or at least indifferent to faith. And given that most of the US public does identify as religious, this is important, because if the values and concerns of scientists are seen as not aligning with the values and concerns of an individual or community, that's going to have an impact on how they and their science are perceived. And this was noted by Dan Kahan almost 20 years ago, kind of summarizing the state of science communication, in particular talking about climate change, that people acquire their scientific knowledge by consulting others who share their values and whom they therefore trust and understand. And that's a really critical through line in thinking about engagement with different communities. And as just an example of this, I just wanted to highlight Dr. Salman Hamid, who does a lot of engagement with Muslim communities. and in particular is very mindful of language as a barrier to science engagement. And so he has a YouTube channel in Urdu where he talks about science and particularly astronomy. So science is a process for generating and disseminating knowledge, and it's something that people do. It has a historical and cultural context. And distrust of science and scientists, particularly in marginalized communities, is, in my opinion, not an anti-science position. It is an informed and rational position. Because there are many examples, historical examples of scientists using science, the power of science and authority of science in ways that disproportionately harm marginalized communities. The field of eugenics, which was a mainstream position in the first half of the 1900s, had broad support in the scientific community, was very much a part of science and the AAAS's ideas about human diversity and the nature of humanity. There were also other examples, such as the Tuskegee syphilis experiment, where Black men with syphilis were left untreated for decades, which in many cases led to their deaths and the infection and deaths within their families in an act that is genocide. So this is part of the historic legacy of science in this country for many marginalized communities. These histories matter, and these dynamics, these very harmful, toxic dynamics, are not just history. They are also part of communities' ongoing lived experiences with racism in science and medicine. As just one example, even as vaccine rates in the US are rising, there remain very profound disparities in infection rates, in hospitalizations, and in deaths across different ethnic groups within the US. So this chart is just illustrating, so if looking at American Indian or Alaska Native, Black, Hispanic, and Asian relative to white deaths or hospitalizations, that American Indians and Alaska Natives and Black Americans have, upwards of 2 or 3 times or more the hospitalization and death rates of white Americans. And this is not about vaccine hesitancy, or at least not about that alone. This is about inequality of resources, access, and care. So those of us who hold privileged backgrounds or identities should recognize that members of marginalized communities, whether they belong to faith communities or not, don't necessarily see people like themselves in science, or that see that science is welcome to them, or serving them or their communities. Who, just as another scientific context, who gets identified as an authority, who gets written up in textbooks, shown in film clips. It's our collective responsibility to be very mindful of these issues. And this includes being very mindful of, again, invoking that lofty rhetoric about science and service to everyone. And so sometimes the best way to support impactful science engagement, depending on our own identities and backgrounds and privileges, is to focus on supporting and elevating others who are in a better position to engage. And I think impactful and inclusive science communication, knowing when to step away and support others, is a key skill. And then yet another point, something that we talk about in our workshops and unpack quite a bit more than I will do today. Everyone has a worldview. Everyone in this call has a worldview. You can think of this in a metaphor as a house that's built on ethics, cultural norms, relationships, personal history, and philosophy. And for most people around the world, some form of faith or spirituality is part of that worldview. Awe, wonder, curiosity, a desire to understand how the natural world works are really central to scientific inquiry and have wide appeal. They're part of what makes science appealing and interesting to so many in the public and for scientists. But whatever their own worldview, if scientists, science communicators, and educators implicitly or explicitly signal that faith, this core component of most people's identities, is not welcome in science or is in opposition to science, they put people in a position of having to choose between engagement with science and being true to who they are, their communities, their families, their values. So presenting science in a way that directly attacks the foundations of someone's worldview will often be perceived as threatening and can provoke strong emotions. And people tend to respond poorly to being insulted or being told that their core beliefs are wrong. And all this is true of everyone, not just people of faith. For this reason, attacking or dismissing core beliefs, values, or concerns is usually counterproductive. A better approach, informed by what the research suggests is actually effective, is to meet people where they are. To extend this metaphor one more step, don't bring a hammer, bring a ladder. Give people space and opportunity to affirm their values and identity, to reflect, to express curiosity, and to identify how maybe new or challenging information might fit into their worldview. It means setting the stage for future engagement and learning and reflection. And it means recognizing that what people think isn't something that you are ever going to decide for them. With all this in mind, and this will be the last kind of our kind of backgroundy stuff, some 3 general best practices for science engagement guide our work, in which if you take anything from this presentation, I hope you take these points. First, be strategic, meaning be intentional about your objectives for particular audiences and contexts, recognizing that engagement is an iterative process, that there's no universal script. We encourage you to start with communities, whether talking about faith communities or otherwise, that you are already a part of or that you have some connection to. We encourage you to be mindful of your own time and energy and focus on what is feasible and that you enjoy doing. Second, be respectful. This doesn't mean you need to agree on everything. It's especially important when you disagree with others. It means approaching others with cultural humility, which in a nutshell means a mindset of curiosity rather than judgment. Give people opportunity to say what they value, to talk about what they believe and why. And to affirm the dignity of others as people and try to be part of the dialogue and meet people where they are, sometimes metaphorically, sometimes literally. And finally, be human. Science is a process. It's something people do. It has a historical and cultural context. It is not just a pile of facts. Storytelling is powerful. Look for opportunities to highlight or elicit awe and wonder and curiosity because those have wide appeal. That's what makes science interesting. Always look for common ground to build upon, particularly around identity and culture. And recognize that particularly when engaging with faith communities, it's often, and if it's a faith community you're not a part of, it's more constructive to focus on building around shared values than around shared beliefs. And very often, spending any time with other people who are engaging in good faith about science, you will be able to identify shared values. Okay, so what do we do? How do we put all this into practice? Well, we serve on a number of projects, either that we are leading or that we're a consultant on within the broader theme of science and theological education. And in a nutshell, these are projects to help equip religious scholars and leaders with the knowledge and experience to constructively engage with their communities about science issues. We know from social science research, and you've seen this in the coronavirus pandemic, among other topics, that people do approach their faith leaders about science and society issues, whether that's vaccination, public health issues, science that's in the news, artificial intelligence, whatever. And many faith leaders want to share good information, but don't necessarily have a robust science background. So the science and theological education work that we do is really intended to support current and future faith leaders in constructive science discourse. The largest of these projects, Science for Seminaries, began as a pilot project in 2013 and has been followed by a larger project, which is now in its 4th iteration, rounds of seminaries. And this is a project to support seminary and theological schools in integrating science into their core curricula and in hosting science events in their institutions. And the scope of this project has been really immense. 42 seminaries have received funding to support the integration of science into coursework on any number of topics: history and philosophy of science, neuroscience, origins and evolution, artificial intelligence, privilege, scientific racism. These are all topics that have been integrated into courses through this program. We anticipate that as the project winds down in 2022, it will have impacted at least 120 faculty, over 200 courses, thousands of students, and has led to well over 100 campus events, although this is a little bit fuzzy because of the challenges of in-person events. And some evaluation of the long-term impacts of this project are underway, which if you know about evaluation in science communication, that's very exciting to be able to look at the long-term impacts 3 or 5 or 8 years on from a big project like this. We also have some smaller projects, continuing education for pastors and scientists for synagogues, which we are an advisor on. That project is led by an organization called Sinai and Synapses and a rabbi, Dr. Jeff Middleman. And both of these projects are really about supporting existing clergy, existing faith leaders in their professional development, but otherwise very similar to in theme to the Science for Seminaries program. Activities, coursework, public events, opportunities for dialogue between scientists and faith leaders about science and society issues. And again, the scope of topics is really diverse. And I'm going to keep moving because I want to make sure we get to discussion. So then the other big bucket is engaging scientists and faith communities. So these projects are really different ways in which we support scientists and science communicators in engaging with the largely religious US public. So less about engaging with religious institutions and more about engaging with the public and with a greater focus on scientists and science communicators. So what forms has this taken? This has included things like developing workshops in collaboration with the AAAS Center for Public Engagement. Over 1,000 people, scientists have voluntarily attended workshops that we've offered at science society meetings, at university campuses, at informal science learning institutions, and other conferences. So that's been very exciting. This is one workshop at the American Association of Physical Anthropologists annual meeting. We've also offered webinars. Sometimes this is just a conversation about us and our work, and that was the case when I did a webinar with Skype to Scientists last year. Last week, however, we did a panel at Inclusive SciComm, where we highlighted 4 panelists speaking as experienced science communicators and as members of different faith traditions, including 2 pastors and a theologian. And Jory, I'm very mindful of time, so I will wrap this up in a moment. We host university events. These have encompassed a range of topics: origins, artificial intelligence, engagement with indigenous worldview and identity. Since there's been 6 of these events at university campuses since 2018. And many of these events included profiling perspectives of non-scientists, and that was an important part of that project. And Brianna Pobner, who has participated at Vanderbilt, I think is a prior speaker in this Lunch and Learn series. We've also hosted events at scientific societies to highlight work on culturally and religiously inclusive science engagement that's already happening within those fields, fields like astronomy, earth and space science, biological anthropology, genetics, among others. We host an annual event each December, which we used to call a holiday lecture, but now we are calling December dialogues on some forefront science and society issue. Recent topics have included human diversity, climate change, and science, ethics, and faith in science fiction. And then we're also starting to work in community and citizen science, looking for ways to connect through platforms like Zooniverse, how faith communities can actually participate in science and make real contributions as faith communities to scientific inquiry. And then I just want to conclude by noting that in this space, it can be challenging. It can be, I think, a little bit daunting, especially if one is not part of faith communities, to kind of decide how to start or how to get started. And you shouldn't start from square one. And a big part of our program is trying to find ways to support scientists in doing this work impactfully and well, and guided by evidence-based best practices. And the kind of resources that we develop, including video series, event recordings, profiles of different scientists working in different contexts, articles, project reports summarizing what we do. We have gathered these, and we will continue to build these at this website, science-religion-dialogue.org, and I encourage you to check those out. And with that, I will thank you for your time, and for Joy for tolerating a few extra minutes there. And I will stop sharing my screen. Stop share. There we go.
There we go. Yeah, great.
All right.
Thank you so much, Robin. And no worries. I mean, it was terrific, and you're well within the time limit, so that's fine.
Awesome.
By the way, I'll also mention you just had a friend and colleague of mine, Nalini Nadkarni, was on the previous slide.
Yes.
She was also a former speaker in this Lunch and Learn series. So one big happy family. So that was terrific. Thank you so much for the background information. We will get to questions. I want to just remind people that you are welcome to put questions in chat if you have them. We also asked you to submit questions at the time that you RSVP'd, and we got several questions that way. And then, as always, I have several questions of my own that I will sprinkle in as well. So, but that was terrific. And I'm going to start with sort of very big picture things related to some of the topics that you discussed. And the first question, which was submitted previously, was someone said, I'm particularly interested in working with faith communities to develop overlapping support and advocacy networks where those connections don't currently exist. So any advice or examples about that process would be greatly appreciated. And you gave examples of some of the things that you're doing, but I think that the essence of the question is for people who want to get into this space and do more within their own communities. Certainly they can, tap into what you're doing with Dozer and some of the resources that you have, but do you have other ideas or suggestions for how someone could build some space for themselves here?
Yeah, so that's a great question. And I would say that on one level, it's almost always better to start in communities that you are already a part of. It doesn't mean you shouldn't ever stray beyond that, but like if you're getting started, like if you're not part of a faith community, I don't know that I would necessarily jump into that. Like maybe there's a kind of a side route to go into that, like start doing Boy Scout engagement, or like in your local cycling club or your local neighborhood that just happens to include faith communities or a church or something. So it's always best to start in places where you are already. And I would also say, in my experience, and I don't know the specifics of what the support advocacy networks might be. In my experience, I think that scientists and science people who do science engagement tend to underestimate what kind of networks already exist. So if you're like working, let's just throw out some examples: mental health advocacy, HIV, climate change, local environmental concerns, COVID-19 vaccination questions. There are faith communities, I guarantee, I would put money, there are faith community networks already active in all of those spaces in your community. I can't guarantee it. I'm very, very confident that that's the case. And so one route would be to not, and this is something else I tend to highlight and emphasize for people. If you can avoid building something new, don't build something new. Tap into an existing network, an existing trusted source, an existing listserv, existing communities of faith leaders, of organizations who are active in what you want to work in, because those networks exist and are powerful, and often are well-meaning but don't necessarily have scientific expertise to draw upon, and that expertise can be really welcome. So that's, I think, the critical thing. Start local, make sure that these networks don't exist already, and if they do, then try to connect to them. If you do find yourself in like kind of starting from nothing, just recognize that that's going to be a long process. I mean, I'll speak as someone who has had the experience of putting a lot of blood, sweat, and tears into an event and nobody shows because we failed to do the groundwork of creating a network. and tapping into existing networks. And so you can do it from scratch, but that's a hard path.
Yeah, no, that's all great advice. And I want to particularly second the point you made about leveraging existing resources rather than recreating the wheel. I do a lot of work in broader impacts, which a lot of people on this call probably are familiar with that. It's the NSF has this requirement that if you're going to get a grant from them, you have to have a component in there of public engagement in what you do. And I'm always saying the same thing to people. Don't try to create or recreate the wheel. Don't start from scratch. Build on existing resources and leverage existing resources, because there's so many good things out there already. And your likelihood of success goes way up if you can leverage existing infrastructure and resources rather than starting from scratch. So I think that's terrific advice. Thank you. All right, so you sort of addressed this. This is another question that was pre-submitted. You sort of addressed this. You talked about the overlap of scientists as people of faith, or people of faith who are supportive of science. But one of the questions was, how do you organize a society that has, in quotes, scientists and believers who disagree what is an action in the public space that is good or effective? And I think the essence of this question is, there are people who overlap, who are people of faith and also scientists, but clearly there's also this divide. And so how do we make progress and move forward in society when there are still people who identify firmly as one or the other and aren't open to the overlap?
So that's another great question. I think that one of the interesting findings in the social science research on sort of science-religion conflict is that, and I think I have these numbers right, I think it's like 60% of people will say that science and religion are often in conflict. But when you ask religious Americans, how often do you even experience this in your own life? Only sometimes. It drops to like 30%. So I would say that one layer of the onion of this is to recognize that people perceive a lot of conflict that doesn't necessarily align with what people actually experience in their own lives. Like that we see a lot of discussion about, debates and did evolution happen? And there's a framing of conflict that has its own really fascinating history, by the way, not to derail everything. But most people don't actually experience that in their own lives, or they experience it around these very specific topics. Reproductive health, origins and evolution, climate change, that for a variety, or GMOs, that variety of reasons are really tied up with identity and values. And I think that solving societal ills is beyond the scope of the Dozer program, but I think that I want to cite a scholar of sort of religion and public life, Chrissy Stroop, who's she's very critical of religion, but I think she's also very principled and fair as in terms of how religion can participate in public life. And her framing is something I've said earlier, which is that we need to really unite around shared values, not shared beliefs. And I think that that's a really powerful framing to be thinking about pluralistic society and how we deal with difference in the public sphere. She has some great summary comments and reflections on her conception of pluralism, which I think is a very powerful one. And so I would say that would be a starting place.
Yeah, excellent. And you had a quote at the very beginning, I think it might have been your first slide, from Catherine Hayhoe, who's a climate scientist and also a person of faith. And she says much the same thing, that it really needs to be more about looking for common ground and trying to avoid some of the things that are dividing people. So along those lines, I'm wondering.
So if I could just add one comment to that, I do think it's not, we don't serve ourselves well either by glossing over difference completely. And I think that part of the discourse about science and society, including how it's been leveraged in communities and how it's been interpreted, including its intersections with faith traditions, is how science has done harm. and in particular, as I mentioned earlier, like racism and human difference and ableism and harm to marginalized communities. And I think that part of this discourse, part of the healing or getting to a better place as a society really does require us to not gloss over that. I just wanted to make that point. I'm sorry.
Right. Great, thanks. So sort of following up on the previous question, I'm sure you're familiar with projects such as the Clergy Letter Project, which for those who aren't familiar is a multi-denominational effort to have members of the clergy essentially sign on to a statement that says that there is no fundamental conflict between faith and science. And of course, Pope Francis has made statements to that effect and being supportive of science. I'm wondering if you can give us a sense of, how effective are those efforts? Are there data to support that the messenger being a person of faith is a lot more powerful than hearing it from someone who is identified primarily as a scientist, for example?
So the short answer is yes. I think that there is now evaluation in science communication and engagement is I'm sure you've done sessions on this. Evaluation is actually quite challenging. What impact is anything that we're doing having? Having said that, there is research that shows that like trusted messengers, messengers that are in local languages or reflect where you have scientists who are part of the ethnic or racial community which they are engaging with, or who otherwise signal we are part of the same group, we share some of the same values and identity. That does have an impact. And Catherine Hayhoe, in fact, is one of the examples where this has actually been formally researched, that as an evangelical scientist, she does have an impact. Like that does have an impact on how her messages are perceived. There's also research that it can not work. So for example, I'll use Pope Francis as an example, where people, and there's research on this, I don't have the citation, but like Catholics who are already kind of not climate change skeptics, who are accepting of anthropogenic climate change, they read statements by Pope Francis about climate change, and they're very supportive, and they're like, yes, this is great, I support this wholeheartedly. And if you are already a skeptic, a Catholic skeptic of anthropogenic climate change, you read that, you say, well, the Pope doesn't know what he's talking about. So there are limits, but this is certainly part of what science communication needs to be mindful of. What it means to be inclusive, to do inclusive science communication is being very mindful of who messengers are, who is speaking on behalf of science, who is engaging with communities, and representation and identity is very much a part of that.
And just again, to follow up on that, one of the questions I had for you specifically was, when you are engaging with communities of faith, do you make a point of telling them about your background, that you were raised Catholic and that you have many people of faith that are in your family? Do you find that helps, or does it seem like you're, well, I'll stop with that.
Yeah. So I didn't used to. I used to keep it kind of ambiguous. And I realized that that's actually a little bit of a power play, or at least what I've come to believe is that's a little bit of a power play, because I am kind of, if I'm not kind of owning my identity, and I'll go a step further and say, so I currently consider myself to be an agnostic and an atheist, but I don't view, most of my family is Catholic. I don't view faith as something to be ashamed of. I respect all diversity of faith traditions in my family and beyond. It's just not something that speaks to me personally. And I have decided that it's generally a good idea to kind of, and sometimes it's called like a positionality, like to kind of make explicit where you are coming from. And I think that that's, and I could be convinced otherwise, but I think that that's helpful in just creating a more equitable conversation. I used to keep it ambiguous because I felt like that could also be helpful in sort of I don't know where he falls, so I don't want to offend him, and I'll just keep things nice. But I've my current thinking is that it's better to just put my cards on the table.
Yeah, interesting. Yeah, I spent many years in my career doing outreach for an evolution research center, and this question came up a lot with me. People would ask me during my public engagement activities, "Are you a person of faith or not?" And I was always very just my strategy was just to be open and honest and share with them my views, which are very similar to yours, I think. But when I would prepare graduate students and postdocs and others to go out and do evolution outreach for the first time, what I told them, because they had a lot of concern about that, and what I told them was, if you feel more comfortable just saying that faith is a personal issue and you're there just to focus on science, then if that makes you feel more comfortable, that's appropriate as well. But I think it's one of those things where each individual has to decide what works for themselves.
I think that's very true. And I'll add that I think one of the ways to kind of make that a very positive thing, if you're choosing to kind of disclose or share a little bit more about yourself, is being ready to talk about, whether it's something like evolution or something else, being ready to talk about in very supportive, enthusiastic ways, scientists of faith, because that helps kind of push back against the perception that scientists and that the scientific enterprise is only for atheists, is only for non-believers, which is very much a common perspective in the public and among scientists, wrongly.
Yeah, no, great point. And I always had sort of that in my back pocket. I had that list of scientists who were also people of faith. So, so I want to get to a question that was submitted in chat just now. I think this is a great question. I'm just going to read this straight from the chat. So it says, thank you, Rob, for this talk. Is there a plan for the reverse, for theological education in the sciences, not limited to community engagement, but in the academy? Yeah, I mean, that's essentially the question is, do you know, are there efforts to bring more theological education into science training?
So I think the short answer is I've certainly heard conversations about that. That's something that a theologian in our network has raised more than once. And I think it's a very understandable ask. Like, if we're going to create like equitable, dynamics, like shouldn't this be part of that? And I would say that there are, like, when the National Academy, and this is just one example that comes to mind, like when the National Academy of Sciences does like gene editing panels, they often will bring in people who are explicitly there to kind of represent faith traditions or faith perspectives. So some of that does happen, and certainly our program, like part of our whole thing is we are seeking to platform non-scientists in discussion of science and society issues. So it's not theological education, but it is certainly like trying to model more inclusive discourse. And I would say that participants in some of our projects are being exposed to theological education. So it's happening on an individual level, but all that is to say, I don't know of any projects where it's actually like scientists getting theological education, theological grounding, except at like institutional levels. Like there's something like that at Notre Dame, and there's something like that at Catholic University, things like that. And it's worth thinking about. I mean, I think it's from the Dozer program's perspective, our lane is as a science society, and like even engagement with faith communities, I think people push back on that and critique that, and I respect that perspective completely. And I think that if we were doing theological education for scientists, I think that would just have to be done very carefully to honor our, who we are and where we are as a science society. Because I don't think it's a good idea, and this is something we don't want to do. I don't think it's a good idea for a science society to be weighing in on doctrine or theological questions. That's very much not an appropriate lane for the AAAS or our program. Our job is to make sure that science is well represented, that science discourse is constructive and impactful and inclusive. So that's a careful, tricky space. You're not wrong. I see the value of that kind of approach, but it would just be tricky.
Yeah, and of course, there's lots of examples of people trying to bring discussions of faith into a science classroom and getting a lot of pushback, right, from the educators and scientists saying, let's keep that in a theology class and let's focus just on science. And so you're right, it's not a simple situation. There is a question that was just placed in chat, which is there a DOSER email list that I can join to find out about future events? So
yes, I will put a link to that in chat in a moment. Let me
that would be great. So yeah, if you could do that, I think a lot of people would be interested in that. We had a number of questions that were submitted in advance that had to do with specific communities that were faith communities. One of them was about do you have experience working with Catholic communities? And I think you've already talked a lot about that. Another one was what is or has been or could be the engagement with Black church communities, particularly around climate change and environmentalism. Any thoughts on that?
Yeah, so there actually is a group of, for someone, I remember the question about like Catholic scientists, and I'll just say in passing, so there is a group of it's like the Society for Catholic Scientists. So Catholics love talking about Catholics and science and Catholicism and science, in my experience. They love highlighting all the scientists that have been Catholic. They have a Catholic network of scientists. So that is a pretty robust discourse and community. So I will. So if you search for Society of Catholic Scientists, that would be an inroad into that. For Black churches and environmentalism, so that was the topic. That was one of the topics that we discussed at our Inclusive SciComm Symposium last week. Although it was not just about Black Christian churches, we also had a Muslim author who works in science policy and environmental policy. And I think that one of the challenges of environmental justice work is that conservation and environmental justice work is often led by white Americans or people from privileged backgrounds, and the impacts of climate change and environmental destruction and pollution are disproportionately felt by communities of color and marginalized communities. And one of the ways to resolve that very glaring disparity is to empower and support community-led voices and perspectives in environmental justice work. Many Black churches and faith communities, not just Christian, are very much at the forefront of local environmental work and activism. If you check out the AAAS How We Respond program, and I'll put a link to that in chat as well, they have featured there's a Reverend Roderick Burton, who was in our panel at Inclusive SciComm. He talks about his experiences in St. Louis, working in this space. There are other voices talking about community responses to climate change, including communities of color in that program. So that would be a starting point, but I think that it is happening. It's already happening, and one of our collective societal challenges is we need to support those efforts more and give them the visibility and prestige that they deserve, and make sure that funding is reaching them so that they can serve their communities better.
Great, thank you. We are running short on time, so there's a lot of questions that we're not going to get to. I apologize to all of you who submitted questions. I want to ask one more question, shift gears a little bit before we let you go, because I know there are a lot of students that are on this call currently, including some of my own current and former students. And I wanted to ask you, Rob, how does one prepare to do the kind of work that you're doing? I know your background, you talked about a little bit, is primate behavior and evolutionary ecology, and I'm wondering to what extent do you feel you draw on that training to do your job? But in a broader sense, what advice would you have for particularly graduate students, postdocs, who want to get into this type of work more and maybe if they're coming, should they be coming from a STEM background, from a theology background, so any thoughts you have on that?
So one of the key concepts that I mentioned in passing is that I think is so central to science communication work is cultural humility. And if you've heard the term cultural competence, one of the critiques of cultural competence is that it is kind of a mindset where like you check the boxes, like I am competent in engaging with diverse communities that are not my own, and therefore I am set and done. And cultural humility is a little bit more focusing on the journey, not the destination. And it means being very mindful of respecting people enough to let them tell you what they believe and why, and to share what their concerns are, what they would like to talk about. So I think that's one critical component. And I think another critical component, another critical component I think is recognizing that a lot of the discourse about science and science communication and engagement does not acknowledge like power dynamics. And I think that that is also something to be very, very mindful of, like the prestige and power of science and what it means to say, this is what the science says. Like that can be leveraged in really poor ways. In terms of background, I mean, I would say familiarize yourself with some of the literature and best practices. And I think the challenge is sorting. Like AAAS has resources. The AGU, American Geophysical Union, has a sharing science website that has lots of great resources about science communication. I think my general advice, the inclusive SciComm website, which let me post a link, inclusive SciComm, is good as starting points. So understand that there's a science of science communication and familiarize yourself with that, and then start small and just kind of start doing it. There are programs, and I'll give a shout out to George Washington University's Center for the Advanced Study of Human Paleobiology, which integrates science communication and engagement into their graduate program. So you have to do some public engagement with science in order to advance to candidacy, as I understand it. So there are programs that this is kind of built in. If you don't have that kind of institutional support, I think the culture is changing, that this is recognized as like, this is part of what it means to be a scientist now, that you need to have some fluency in public engagement. So maybe see if you can push for institutional change at the department level, at the college level, or institutional level. But yeah, I mean, starting small, familiarizing yourself with the work that's out there. Don't build things from scratch. Look for things you can connect with that exist already. Don't overextend yourself.
Great.
That's
yeah,
the advice
no,
I have.
all good advice. All good advice.
Yeah.
And unfortunately, it is 1 o'clock straight up on the East Coast here, so we need to wrap this up. But Rob, I want to thank you for a great discussion and for wonderful answers to these questions. I want to thank everybody who tuned in to this. And I hope you learned a lot and got a lot out of this. And there's some great links that are in chat. So if you didn't capture all those, feel free to email me. My address is just jory@duke.edu, and I'll put it in chat. And I'm happy to share links with you as well. But thank you very much. And just a pitch again for next month's Lunch and Learn, which is communicating health information to teens. And that will feature a pediatrician here at Duke who specializes in that. So that'll be great as well. So thanks again, Rob. Thanks to all of you for tuning in, and we hope to see you next month.
Thank you. Really appreciate it.